Today, I am joined with Dr. Mark Chavalas, a leading scholar of Mesopotamia and the Bible, and a seasoned field archaeologist. Welcome, Dr. Chavalas.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So I wanted to talk to you today about Mesopotamia and the Bible. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of background of your studies and what led you into this field and your work and
Sure. No, that'd be my pleasure, especially since it's me. So I suppose I'm an expert on myself, at
yeah.
least in terms of my own history. As a young man, I had, uh, especially as a teenager, I had two passions: baseball and learning history. And I thought I was going to play for the Dodgers. The only thing that was stopping me was talent. Everything else was in place. But other than that, I of course still enjoy and still do enjoy sports. But I found that I couldn't get enough of reading history. We would go on travels up the coast. I was born and raised in the Southern California area, but we'd go up the coast and see redwoods and everything. And people would ask me, "What were the redwoods like?" I said, "I don't know. I was in the back seat reading a history book." And this is in my early teens, and so I
Okay.
could probably already tell there was something wrong. So of course, when I got to school, which was Cal State Northridge, I was a math major because that was practical, and I was really good with numbers. But to my utter horror, um, by the way, it wasn't even called Cal State Northridge yet. But to my utter horror, the numbers started becoming letters and curly Q's and other weird signs, and
Right.
couldn't do very well with calculus. In fact, I failed out of it, and so I had to salvage a degree. I said, "Well, I suppose I could do my hobby. I don't see where it would ever take me." So I switched over to history, and I performed decently well. I found that I really liked ancient history, probably for reasons that were not so altruistic. I mean, I was raised in a good Presbyterian home, so I
Okay.
certainly was a believer, intellectually speaking, and um, but I liked ancient history because I found that nobody else was studying it, especially the pre-Greek and Roman stuff, Babylonian and all this other stuff. And so I suppose I could say I was the first kid on my block to learn a lot of this strange stuff. And then I found out I was the only kid on my block that was doing it. And
Okay.
and when you would talk about Mesopotamia or even the ancient languages, I found out it was pretty much a conversation killer wherever I went rather than a conversation starter. And so
Okay.
if I thought it was going to make me cool, it was pretty much the opposite. But I got hooked. And once I was finished with my degree at Cal State Northridge, it had become that while I was there. I asked my professor, I said, "Well, I'd like to keep on studying. I have a decent job in the grocery business and doing fine with that, but I just want to keep on studying this. This is my hobby." And he said, "Well, you can't do it here." I said, "Well, I'm pretty much tied to the area. Where's the closest place?" And he says, "Probably UCLA." So I went and applied there. I actually got rejected the first year because I applied like at the last minute, and found out that I had to do other things. And so I stayed at Northridge and started studying some ancient languages, the wrong. And by the way, they said, "Well, you have to study a modern language too." So I started studying more Spanish. And I found out, well, that wasn't the right one because nobody in Mesopotamian studies writes in Spanish. Well, put it this way, a small amount do. And
Okay.
and so anyway, I finally got it at UCLA for ancient history. And as I was being interviewed, they said, "Well, all you talk about is Mesopotamia, so you need to go with Bucciolati." Um, and I had no idea who he was. I found out rather soon that he was like the leading authority on
Oh,
Mesopotamian studies,
oh,
especially
awesome.
and its connection in terms of language, but he also was a field archaeologist, and he had already done biblical studies in Italy. And so all of these things were sort of tied together. But I didn't know it. So I just was going on my merry way doing ancient studies. A lot of my graduate student colleagues were former seminarians who were interested in getting more background to especially the Old Testament. Um, and so I was there with them, although my field wasn't biblical studies at all. As a Christian, of course, I was quite interested in making those connections, but I was doing it uh,
Mhm.
with the emphasis on Mesopotamia, which was different than most of my colleagues.
Okay.
Those others who were centered around Mesopotamia weren't particularly interested in biblical studies, and so I was sort of maybe an albatross, which was fine. It was just sort of a different way, but I think God used it in an interesting way because when I was finished with my doctor's degree, um, I started thinking about maybe I should start looking for employment. This was a great hobby, and and I always thought the grocery store was a means to an end. I just didn't know what the end was. And so when I started um, looking, uh, I was looking only in secular schools. And funny thing is, they had no problem with me because I didn't have the quote unquote stain of a seminary or Bible college degree on them. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have touched me with a 10-foot pole.
Okay. Hmm.
So in the late 80s, I got uh, my university position here at the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse, and, which I knew nothing about. When you do ancient history, especially Near Eastern history, you sort of go where there's a job. Um,
Okay.
you don't stay put. In fact, I was teaching at Cal State Northridge part-time for about 5 years, and uh, I saw the writing on the wall. I was a part-timer, even though I had a full-time position. I mean, I was getting a full amount of classes. There were people above me who had written 3 or 4 books, and they still weren't getting a permanent position either. So I realized this isn't this isn't a good fit for me. I have to be willing to go anywhere. And
Okay.
so anywhere was upper Midwest, which I knew absolutely nothing about. Uh, and so I got here in 1989 and retired just a year ago. And I
Okay.
was able to teach just about anything I wanted. Uh, about 10 years in, I talked to my department chair and said, I really would like to teach Akkadian, the language itself. And he said, well, if you think you could get any students, go for it. So the first time I offered it, this is about 2000, I think. I got 55 students.
Wow.
And I polled the students, in there. None of them were necessarily students who were interested in ancient Near East.
Hmm.
Um, and I said, "Why are you in here?" They said, "Well, I'm a business major, and this looked really interesting, and I needed an elective, and
Wow.
I was my discipline was driving me crazy." I said, "Okay, great." And of those 55, about over 30 of them survived. Well, they probably all survived, but intellectually speaking, they kept on going, and another 12 said, "We want to keep on going." And so
Oh,
uh,
wow.
I ended up doing a 6 semester course that would go around. I didn't always do 6 semesters, but occasionally I would have students who wanted to do more, and I even had a student or two who wanted to do Sumerian. Um, and this is basically at a comprehensive institution which does not have a we hadn't had a graduate program in history since the 70s, and so this was pretty unique. And when I would teach a course on ancient Israel, the Bible was my main textbook. It's pretty hard
Mhm.
to teach a course on Israel without
Yeah.
that. And of course, the Bible was used in almost every one of my courses. Since I was the only ancient historian there, I would teach courses on ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Iran, ancient Turkey. Um, and the biblical material was there at the forefront, and students, didn't know that this was an option. And so I was using the Bible like any other ancient source, trying to evaluate it. And
Right.
students who were Christians would suspect I was a Christian. They would come to my office. I said, "Well, now that you're in my office, we can talk about anything you want."
Hmm.
And so that was a real blessing. There really are very few Bible believing Christians who have been teaching, let's say, Old Testament studies in secular institutions. And
Okay.
like I said, it wasn't my plan. Yeah, I think that it was many respects, it was God leading me into this, because if I would have planned out my career, I would have gone to a Bible college and a seminary. Um,
Right.
and if I would have done that, I probably, hopefully would have had a nice, fruitful career, but it wouldn't have been at a secular school. And so it taught me a lot of things. It taught me how to interact. Um, and now that I'm done with that, my interest now is to try to simply bring to an interesting viewing audience the the years I've had primarily trying to look at the Bible from a standpoint of the ancient Near East. I'm not the only one who does this, but I'm trying my hand at to the outside environment. And so far it's been very interesting.
Okay, yeah. So a couple things there. So language-wise, what languages did you need to acquire for these studies in Mesopotamia?
Well, uh, first modern languages, and we just sort of joke on this, is that you had to learn, there were two modern languages that you had to learn, German and French. And really a reading knowledge of them. And so, I mean, I've been to conferences where uh, they were, where the conference was either French or German or sometimes even Italian. Since my professor was Italian, it was sort of incumbent upon us to learn a little bit of that too. But
Hmm.
so with a reading knowledge, I was able to get through. Although our joke was German was harder than the Mesopotamian languages, and and that's sort of a inside joke because
Right.
it's just very difficult. But
Okay.
somehow I can plow through a text in German. If I find out that there's an English translation to something, I will rush to that,
Yeah.
as soon as I possibly can. But
Right.
so those are the modern languages. And by the way, before I go any further, it's going to sound impressive, but I want to tell you that I'm probably equally incompetent in most of them. So in other words, I have a reading knowledge of German and French, so I can get by them. Don't give me any French or German poetry or
Right.
anything else. And so I can read in my discipline, but if you ask me to do something outside my discipline, I'm going to
Right.
left hanging. So in the ancient languages, I did my requisite classical training because my minor fields were Greek and Roman. So I had a year or so of Greek, and I sat in on some Latin courses because they were offered at the same time as Greek.
Okay.
So I did enough to be dangerous and to be able to use a dictionary to know what I'm doing in terms
Right.
of intimate knowledge of grammar. Uh, I leave that to scholars. So, if, for example, if I'm working with something in the New Testament, like I just did on my own podcast, here's the cup for it, the buried Bible. So, if your
Perfect.
listeners are interesting, but I
Yeah,
just did.
I'll get a link for that.
Yes, great. So I just did something with Mark chapter 5, trying to show some Mesopotamian parallels. But of course, I had to sound like I knew what I was talking about with Greek. Um, and I can do that as long as I'm aware of the fact that, Greek is something that I've occasionally uh, said something or here and there in ancient Greek, but I've got to leave it to New Testament scholars to work with the details and intricacies of things. After that, then I had to go into the actual languages themselves. The two primary ones were Akkadian and Sumerian. Akkadian was the centerpiece of my studies. Um,
Okay.
by the way, the two different dialects are in the north are Assyrian, in the south are it would be called Babylonian, which of course is a much better known term for your audience. Um, both of them are, by the way, considered to be from the same language family, but there's actually some evidence when you read the ancient text that Assyrians and Babylonians probably couldn't communicate very well with each other in,
Okay.
in terms of their dialects. And I'm wondering whether it's something like maybe even the difference between either Spanish and Italian or maybe Spanish and Portuguese, where of course they're close enough and you can probably get by, but they're considered to be separate languages. Um,
Right.
but in any event, um, Akkadian is a Semitic language. I don't. How do you categorize it in terms of its connection with Biblical Hebrew? Probably not a direct descendant is Biblical Hebrew, but maybe Akkadian is a great uncle.
Okay.
But because of that, there are maybe 2,000 words in biblical Hebrew that are single attested words. If you can find a cognate in Akkadian or let's say Ugaritic, which is even a closer language, um, that is of immense help to try to help you understand things. Furthermore, biblical Hebrew, the only real biblical Hebrew texts we have are the Bible. And so you really can't, in my opinion, you really can't go down to, let's say, rabbinical sources or let's say Second Temple Hebrew to try to understand what the biblical text is saying quite often, because that would be like looking at modern English to try to figure out words that Chaucer used.
Okay.
I mean, English is English, but of course, words change in their meaning. And so uh, sometimes delving into Akkadian material is more useful to try to understand, especially if there are phrases that are similar between biblical Hebrew and Akkadian. And of course, they're, I think, both in the same, not simply just the same linguistic world, they're in the same cognitive environment, the same intellectual environment, the way that they perceive their surroundings, as I'm going to try to argue a little bit later on.
Okay.
And so that's Akkadian, and that was, like I said, that was my primary language. But of course, if you learn Akkadian, you have to dabble in Sumerian, which is the parent language for cuneiform behind this. And so there's a variety of reasons for this that I don't think I want to go into right now because it gets sticky and complicated. But Sumerian is an ancient language that is about as close to a Semitic language as English is to Chinese. So
Okay.
there's no relationship whatsoever. And oddly enough, even though the first cuneiform texts are in Sumerian, within a millennium, well, maybe a little bit longer than that, we start having texts in Akkadian, and it looks as if the two languages have been interacting for a long, long time. And so, in other words, when we start having Akkadian texts, if this was a 4-act play, we're probably in the middle of Act 3 already. And so, for example, we used to think that all the loan words in Sumerian went into Akkadian. Now we're beginning to think that they actually were going back and forth. And the only analogy I can think of, in my own neck of the woods is living in Southern California. A lot of my Hispanic friends and acquaintances, spoke something that we joked was called Spanglish, because, of course, they might have been raised speaking Spanish at home, learning English, let's say, in a public school environment, and then mixing them together indiscriminately. And then within a generation or two or three, um, they might not have lost their Spanish, but they could see there's so much interaction, between the two languages. For example, how many words in English come from Spanish? An overwhelming percentage of them come from Mexican food items, which
Right.
if you don't have them in English, you have to use the Mexican word, whether it's taco or burrito or anything else. And
Right. Yeah.
this is what happens with Sumerian and Akkadian. And then on a peripheral thing, you have to, I mean, in order to really start reading other documents, I had to learn a little bit of Hittite. I sat in on a year of courses in Hittite, and since it's an Indo-European language, uh, the that at least was doable for me. And the cuneiform, even though it was markedly different than the cuneiform, they modified the system dramatically. At least it wasn't a shock to my system. Most of the students in those courses were Indo-European students, and so cuneiform for them was just like a horrific
Right.
thing. Uh, but for cuneiformists, it's like, okay, well, they played games with cuneiform, but I can sort of understand what they've done here. So
Okay.
so at least I can look at Hittite and make sense of it. We dabbled in Hurrian, but that's another language like Sumerian that doesn't seem to have any, at least linguistically, any connections to other languages. Urartian later on looks like it. And so, in other words, if you're a cuneiformist, you should be able to at least try to make sense of some of these other languages. I can't say that I learned any of the Elamite language from Iran, um, or Old Persian. In other words, there's a whole load of cuneiform languages that employ cuneiform, but it's really no different than how many languages use our alphabet, whether it's the Greek version or the Latin version. And many of these languages have nothing to do with each other. And so, language and script, I mean, in fact, when I started learning the cuneiform script, we would go to these 8-hour seminars at Bucciolotti's residence, which was a long time. And we would bring our sack lunch, and I would write my name in cuneiform
Nice.
until I stopped, until it was no longer a novelty
Yeah.
uh, to do that. But and so you can write any language in any script if you want, at least theoretically
Right.
speak. So, and by the way, I was not a language person. And so having to learn all these languages, I remember when I got to UCLA and they first thing said, well, you've got to start learning languages. I sort of blurted out, well, I came here to study history. What's the deal? And they
Mhm.
nicely told me, well, actually, if you want to study ancient history, you have to do it in the original text. Well, I'm thinking, nobody told me that. This is false advertising.
Whoops. Yeah.
But of course, I'm now convinced that you really must do that. Um,
Yeah.
and even to the interested viewer, my answer is, there are so many resources out there that I did not have in the 70s when I was a graduate student that you have easy access to. That's the good thing. The bad thing is it makes people think they're experts when they can just sort of jump in and use electronic dictionaries, etc. And
Hmm.
I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's not how it works. It still takes a lot of effort. And I'll have, even in my own podcast, somebody will make a comment, and I say, well, where did you get that information? Well, I clicked on AI. I'm thinking, well,
Right.
that's a nice place to start, but AI doesn't know how to critique its sources, uh,
Right.
and so anyway, and of course, Bucciolotti, like I said, was a field archaeologist. And so soon after I got there, he said, oh, by the way, we're going to Syria to excavate at Tel Ashara Terka, and you're coming with us. Um, and
Oh,
I'm in my early 20s. I had never really even left California. I think my parents took a trip when I was 2 years old to Portland to visit family. But other than that, I'd never really been out of the state, let alone the country. And I confess that Sandbox was not my I didn't like Sandbox when I was a little kid,
right.
or go camping or to do anything like that. So thinking about camping in Syria along the Euphrates, um, it was like, well, this is pretty interesting. But I remember after my first season, flying home thinking that was a really interesting experience. I would never do that again uh,
Right.
in a million years. And of course, the next year, I was,
Yeah.
being recruited to go again and
Okay.
again and again and again until I had 9 seasons under my belt. Um,
Okay.
but in fact, when I was hired at the University of Wisconsin, the position was ancient history / archaeology. They didn't have an archae program, but they were building it. And so, my joke with the archaeologists that I got to know on campus is that I could teach archaeology courses, but I was a historian who masqueraded as an archaeologist. And so, um, my field career was over once I got here. Um, and so I emphasized the history and the languages. But
Oh,
all my courses were cross-listed with our burgeoning archaeology program, which was really fun.
okay.
It got me to learn a lot of new things, and sort of stretch my um, mind in many ways. And I actually was able to send a lot of students onto biblical archaeology digs, either in Jordan or Israel, not Syria, which is not an easy place to go into unless you're invited. Uh,
Okay.
but
Okay. Very nice.
yeah,
Yep. Now, now I have a question. So I believe it was the 1800s where they really started to uncover a lot of these documents,
yes,
and this gave a stir in the especially in the biblical world. where it started bringing accusations against the Hebrew Bible, saying they're just copying the Mesopotamians. How did that affect you, and what is maybe we could get into maybe some of the texts of the Mesopotamian, some shared motifs, and kind of take a little look at parallels and contrasts between the two to maybe understand the context of what's happening there a little better than has been framed.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about the history of that journey. In fact, maybe, let's see. Oh, here it is. Um, I actually try to work through this uh, in this book that came out about 25 years ago, Mesopotamia in the Bible. I think hopefully your
Yeah,
audience
yeah,
can see that pretty
perfect.
well.
Yeah.
In the first chapter, it's an edited book with Lawson Younger, but in my first article, basically I call it Assyriology and the Bible and a century of tension because Assyriology is the discipline of studying cuneiform, primarily Akkadian, because if you study Hittite, you're called a Hittitologist. If you exclusively study Sumerian, you're a Sumerologist. But sort of like the umbrella for all of it is Assyriology. But
Okay.
uh, when this stuff first began to be found, put it this way, the script was being excavated in the 1840s. The script was deciphered, and that's basically another story that we shouldn't go into right now. But when they were able to successfully decipher it, which was sort of made public about the 1857, 1858, um, uh, it was pretty. It was pretty. First of all, it was pretty jarring to, let's say, a Victorian type audience
Hmm.
uh, in Europe because most people at that point thought the Bible, was primarily there for its moral heritage. It gave us lots of food, for thought in Sunday school, etc. But the stories themselves were pretty much props. They might have a background to them, but we know little or nothing about them except for maybe a statement in a classical source. If you read your Herodotus or others, which of course any Victorian would be, that was part of their curriculum
Okay.
back then. You might have hints here and there, but and if you read your early church fathers, they would occasionally um, quote some people, and of course the most popular one would be Josephus. Uh,
Hmm.
but but some of the other ones, in other words, if you tried to give you a background to, let's say, the study of Babylonia, which was the southern part of Mesopotamia, you wouldn't know very much about them. But once they started excavating this material and finding cuneiform tablets, and of course, the first major cache of tablets came from Nineveh itself, the northern state, and really 40,000 tablets and fragments or more began pouring
Wow.
in, in the 1840s, and by the late 1850s, they began Rawlinson and others, Hinks, began working with this material, and they did start finding connections between this stuff and the Bible. So, for example, one of the earliest texts that was deciphered. When I say deciphered, I should now say translated. Once they've deciphered it, once they started translating it, it was about Sargon's conquest of the Northern Kingdom. But
Okay.
so of course it's from Sargon's standpoint. Uh,
Right.
and it was exciting on one part, but it was also unnerving from another standpoint because if you read Second Kings, what is about 17, the conqueror of the Northern Kingdom is not Sargon. He's not even mentioned anywhere there. It's Shalmaneser
Okay.
um, the fifth, who happens to be Sargon's successor. So why is Sargon bringing this up? He's only mentioned one time in the Bible in Isaiah chapter 20. And it's sort of assumed that you know all about who he is. It'd be like you and me talking about, I don't know, current politics. And
Hmm.
I bring up Trump, let's say, which of course is going to evoke, strong reactions on any side. But can you imagine if it's 3025 and they have this video and they're thinking, who's this Trump person and why aren't they telling me who it is? You're thinking,
Yeah,
well,
where's the backstory? Yeah.
what's the backstory? And you and I we don't need the backstory. We're living in the current events. And,
Hmm.
and I think that happens quite often in the Bible. But anyway, Sargon claims to be the conqueror of the northern kingdom. The Bible claims that Shalmaneser is, and so there's already this problem. What's going on here? And so there was always, and of course, the other thing is the people who studied the Mesopotamian material, they definitely had their biblical curriculum, and they tried hard to emancipate their field from biblical studies, but they recognized very quickly that the language, the Akkadian language, which they weren't calling it that, they were calling it Assyrian for a variety of reasons. In fact, Akkadian was what they meant by Sumerian, and that had to change. It's complicated and confusing, but um, and so they begin to realize, oh, um, this is a Semitic language. It's similar to biblical Hebrew, but we don't want to be tied down to that. We want to be our own independent discipline, and so they tried hard to create their independence. And with somebody like the Assyriologist Alec, whose son became a biblical scholar, but he was an Assyriologist who knew his Bible quite well. And so when he had public lectures in Germany called Babel und Bibel, Bible or whatever, um, he sort of shocked the system of everyone by claiming that all of the stories in the Bible and all of the cultural paraphernalia in the Bible come from Mesopotamia. He basically became a Mesopotamia centered person, um, and and this intimidated people because most people did not have this background. Even
Right.
Graf and Wellhausen, who came up with their documentary hypothesis, they weren't their field wasn't Mesopotamian studies, which was just a brand new discipline. And so it means clerics out there were now very suspicious of the fact that, well, they found a law code in 1900 in Mesopotamia, the Hammurabi Code, and it's older than the Mosaic Code. Well, how does that work, etc. So the immediate response from the biblical side was skepticism.
Hmm.
Nobody else can read these texts. How do we know that they're reading them right? And we don't like what their conclusions are. Therefore, let's keep this uh,
Yeah.
to the side. And those who were dabbling in that disciplines, who were interested in trying to keep one foot in both fields, were also labeled suspicious, really from both sides. And so they're almost as if there were warring camps. One of my grand uncle professors, Benno Landsberger, came out with I think right about 1926, uh, he came out with an article that became like the centerpiece for Mesopotamian studies. It was like the English translation is something like the conceptual autonomy of the Mesopotamian world. And what he was trying to do is to show that Mesopotamians had their own cognitive environment that was um, independent from the biblical writers. And but as we've begun to learn about this, um, I try to show to people who are bothered or intimidated by this, especially if they're Bible believing Christians, is that um, the Bible itself was part of this cognitive environment. It's not, we kind of like to think, I suppose, that the Bible was transmitted by God, speaking through prophets whose brain was put on hold as God was, pouring information into them, and then they would come out with it. And now but I think really over the last century, the understanding now is, well, that's a little too simplistic, is that the author of the text is a combination of, let's say, divine authority and the human element. I don't even
Hmm.
want to go into authorship right now because that's a thorny issue that I'm trying to understand it from a Mesopotamian perspective.
Okay.
And because I think that the biblical text, especially in the Old Testament, was text centered, not author centered. And the New Testament is the flip side of that. It's author-centered and not text-centered, and that shows the difference between the Near Eastern and the Greco-Roman world. Just
Okay.
food for just food for thought. But
Hmm.
anyway, um, so it sounds intimidating to find out that, oh, there was a flood story for Mesopotamia that's clearly older by at the very least a half a millennium to the biblical one. And there's a law code that's at least a half a millennium older than the Mosaic Code. That is even if you that's if you believe that the law code in the Bible is actually all from the period of Moses, and Moses clearly is from, let's say, 1400. I think the issue is much more complicated than that. I think that's too simplistic. But um, here's my take on this is that when you look at this environment, you have to realize that the biblical writers were living in the same cultural and intellectual milieu. They're part of that environment. And I think the biblical text even admits that when you start looking in Genesis 12, when, right after, you think about it, right after Babel, okay, the dispersion of the nation, of the nations. And by the way, I think Genesis 11 is sequentially before Genesis 10, if it makes sense. In other words, you have to have the dispersion before the nations exist. And then, um, and so there's an interesting emphasis there. But so right after that, Genesis 12 is, of course, God calling Abraham. Well, who's Abraham? Well, he's not Jewish. He's not an Israelite. He he's a goy. He's a Gentile. Well, where is he from? Well, the writer says he's from Ur. And to make sure that you know that we're talking about what Ur, it's Ur of the Chaldees, which is the southern one.
Okay.
It means he's a Mesopotamian. It's in other words, God it's and my joke is from the human perspective, it looks as if God closed his eye, pulled him out of a hat, and pulled him right out of uh, the center. And so, what's going on in Ur? Let's say Abraham is circa 2000, 1900, 1800. I don't know. Um,
Okay.
I don't want to be dogmatic about that.
Yeah.
Ur is one of the most powerful politically and intellectually states in the world at that point. It has been the centerpiece of the Sumerian slash Akkadian tradition for a very, very long time. Even one of the early law codes comes from there. And so Abraham is probably fully a Mesopotamian. His name, by the way, is probably Amorite. Well, who are the Amorites? They're actually not from southern Mesopotamia. They began coming into the area about at least 2 or 3 centuries before this, maybe longer. Um,
Okay.
their language is West Semitic. By the way, we don't have any actual documents in Akkadian, but within the last 10 years, scholars Krebenik and George have actually published an Akkadian slash Amorite lexicon, which is really, really exciting. Amorite is sort of like a early West Semitic language, which is probably a direct ancestor to Biblical Hebrew. And so,
Okay.
which shouldn't be surprising to people. But if Abraham's an Amorite, he's probably thoroughly and 100% pagan in every way. And so my argument is that when God calls him out, God doesn't stop and give him all that correct theological information about the fact that I'm the only God and you have to worship me in this particular way. In fact, it's almost the opposite. This is who I am, and I've got a really wonderful deal for you. All you have to do is be loyal to me. And as we go on, I'll probably teach you things. In fact, as a historian, I look at the next chapters in Genesis as very authentic because the writer um, does not shy away from the fact that Abraham is doing a whole lot of weird pagan stuff that would make the later Israelites extremely uncomfortable. In other words, they're allowing it to stay where it is because that's what it was. That's our received tradition. And so
Okay.
I'm not going to monotheize it for a later audience. But of course, we have evidences of the fact that Genesis is also written with a later uh, it's edited later on for a more current audience. But so Abraham is a Mesopotamian, and so you would expect. So in other words, the the Israelite people admit that they come from Mesopotamia in the same way that if let's just say in this fantasy, God calls you out today in um, in 2025 with a new word for the world. This of course is counterintuitive, but let's just say that in this new environment. So what is he going to do? He's going to speak to you in English, maybe
Hmm.
even with your across the border dialect. In other words, the
Right.
very slight intricacies. Although for me, of course, being from California, Upper Midwest and Canadian sound a lot closer than they do to my dialect down way down here. But
Right.
just the point is, you're going to be speaking in your own language. You're probably going to have church services on the traditional day that people have it here. You're going to probably speak in an environment where you have a service for an hour or two um, in a building. In other words, from somebody from another planet, um, the rudiments of your new religious tradition are going to look a lot like the other ones, and you're going to say, no, 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 wait a minute. The meaning behind what I'm doing is very different. I know I speak, I'll use the same metaphors. Maybe you'll use a football metaphor that's current, or
Yeah.
or job metaphors or whatever, or metaphors about political situation, etc., that everyone would understand. Uh, but but you and so in other words, your cognitive environment hasn't changed, but your message has a meaning behind it that you consider to be very different. And so this is how I look at ancient Israel, that the mere fact that the Israelite documents are later in time than many of the Mesopotamian ones is pretty much immaterial. It's not as if Moses is sitting down there, I need some really good laws. Oh, those Babylonian laws really look cool. My
Yeah.
my answer to that is no, they're living in the same ancient Near Eastern legal environment. And so I would be suspicious if the laws in the Bible were not similar
Right.
to
Yeah.
the Mesopotamian ones. In the same way that, let's say it's 3025 and we're trying to figure out the North American continent, and we find out, laws in Ottawa look like, in 2025 look like laws in Iowa in 1842, and furthermore, they even look similar to laws in merry old England in 1215. And so, what gives? How does this all work? And we're thinking,
Right.
it's the same legal tradition. We understand that. In fact, we know it's so similar. All we like to do is characterize our differences, because the similarities are sort of a given. We already
Right.
know that that we're on the same playing field. So I think for us, when you study the ancient Near East, you have to realize they're from the same playing field. And my joke is that when you look at ancient Israel is 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 almost a copy of its Mesopotamian tradition, except that the meaning behind the Israelite traditions are always dramatically different. They have a shockingly different meaning behind all the rituals. So, for example, when Jehu goes into a Baal temple in 2 Kings, what is it about 2 Kings 10, I think. He goes
Okay.
in there and he says, all right, make sure there are no Yahweh priests in here, only Baal worshipers. And he goes in there and he starts performing Baal rituals. Have you ever wondered why he could do that? He probably could do that because the Israelite ritual and the Canaanite ritual probably look superficially similar. And so he
Okay.
was able to get away with it
Right.
um, because of the superficial similarities. Then, of course, he wastes all of them because of that. And so the similarities look similar. And so let's say that we're looking at the creation traditions. Um,
Right.
um, I think the final edition of the biblical one is probably responding partly to the the Babylonian Enuma Elish and other possible traditions. And so even let's say in verse 2 of Genesis, where it has this random statement that you think, what does that have to do with anything? Darkness was over the face of the deep. Like, why do I need to know that?
Right.
Um, well, the term deep there clearly has an Akkadian parallel with the mother goddess Tiamat, um, who becomes in Genesis a water prop. In other words, she's been depersonalized and she's still there, but of course, the God in Genesis is a God of order. In fact, I think that's the primary purpose of Genesis 1 is not so much to speak about the origin of matter, which you can sort of assume that God is transcendent, but we're never actually told that. It's sort of a logical assumption. Well, if God did this, this, and this, he must be apart from all of this. But the text doesn't even have to do that. To me, as a Christian, I think it's kind of like the same way that Mark looks at Jesus after you've read the whole book and you realize, well, Jesus uses his own authority to stop the wind. He uses his own authority to perform exorcism. Well, who could do that except God? Wait a minute.
Right.
How does that work? Uh,
Right.
and so that's almost more uh, heuristically powerful that the writer does that rather than simply, flat out saying, well, don't you know who this is? Well,
Right.
you know it by his deeds. And so how do I know who the God of Genesis is? He's orderly. Um, he is in complete control. There's no war like there is in the Mesopotamian documents. In fact, in Mesopotamia, what's the origin of matter? Well, matter has its origin by itself. In other words, there's no personhood behind it. From matter comes personhood, which, by the way, as a monotheist, I look at that and scratch my head and say, wait a minute, that's kind of that kind of sounds like Transformers, with
Right.
if you're into that stuff. But as you have this Allspark box or whatever the kids have told me about, like, well, where did
Yeah.
that come from? No, that's it. Uh,
Right.
and so no, there's a simple difference. In Israel, matter comes from personhood that's immaterial. In the ancient Near East, the personhood comes from matter. It's the reverse. Sounds more like Aristotle, by the way, which of course I
Hmm.
think it does. But
Okay.
and so the whole point is it really doesn't matter. I mean, so I think the whole issue of dependence is ridiculously irrelevant in my opinion. Israel
Right.
Israel comes from the same environment, and so when we're looking at it, we can see sometimes that the Israelite writer is perhaps writing in response to traditions in Mesopotamia. Sometimes they are writing similar to it because they're coming from the same intellectual and cultural milieu, just like you would be if you've started your new religious tradition. I remember many years ago, I had a fellow in one of my classes. He was my age and he was just taking the class, and he says, "Hey, listen, I I go to the local um, what's the word for the Unitarian Universalist Church."
Okay.
He says, "I'd like you to come and speak there. Would you like, come and speak there?" I said, "Well, sure." I said, "You know, I'm a Bible believing Christian." "Oh, no, but I like what you talk about." I said, "Okay, great." So I remember it wasn't far from my house. And at the time our kids were all young. And so I brought my whole family. It was on a Sunday morning. We walked
Right.
in there and it looked just like a Protestant service to me. They sang some songs. They weren't the hymns that you would sing in a Protestant service.
Hmm.
They had Sunday school for our kids, and so they went down to Sunday school, and then I gave a talk. Uh,
Right.
and so it looked superficially like what we were doing, but of course the meaning behind it was completely different. And I was not invited back again, that's for sure. But the point is that it looked just like what I do, but the meaning behind it was so different. And so I look at, you
Right.
know, when
Yeah,
an
that makes sense.
when an Israelite is writing about law codes, to me, when I look at Israelite law, uh, the Mesopotamian laws inform me this is what these laws are for. This is how they work on it. So, for example, the rabbis would look at Israelite law and they would basically superimpose it upon their own culture milieu a millennium later. And so they looked at, for example, Deuteronomy 24, which is the first couple of verses looks like it's a law about divorce, but it's actually a case law about a very particular incident that occurs where a man, he marries a woman and then he basically dumps her by defaming her for something that we really don't know, but it's probably of a sexual nature. But she's dumped. She loses. That means she leaves without her dowry or anything else. Uh, Somehow she gets married on to somebody else who either dies or divorces her. And then what's the law? The first guy can't marry her back. And you're thinking, well, that's pretty random. And the rabbis, of course, were trying to figure out why has this occurred? There must be something, cosmic about this. And so he can never marry her back. And you think about it, it's the only so-called divorce law in the Bible, but it's not. It's actually about a guy ripping his neighbor off because the uh, married guy number one, if he marries her, he now gets the woman's dowry for a second time that he had already taken to begin with, and whatever else the woman gets as an inheritance from married guy number two. And so that's the reason. In other words, it's a law about a very particular issue, which um, may or may not be relevant. And so it was a specific law that became a generic law for the rabbis. In the
Okay.
same way, let's say about tattoos. Uh, that tattoo law, by the way, I'm convinced is about the whole issue of you don't mark yourself because it's a mark of slavery, which everyone would have understood in the ancient Near East. Everyone, but it's not explicit in the same way that you're living. I don't know about Canada, but of course in America, if you wander around in public with an orange jumpsuit and maybe a shackle on your leg, they're probably going to assume. So when did you get out of the slammer and maybe
Yeah.
and when I was a kid, it was a black and white striped outfit.
Yeah.
But
I
the whole
remember
point
that.
is that the whole point is that uh, anybody who looks at that knows, oh, wait a minute, you're a
Right.
you're a convict. What are you doing? And so
Okay.
in the ancient Near East, tattoo is a sign of convict, except it was guilty by association with other rituals in Leviticus 19.
Okay.
Um, but when you look at the context of the ancient Near East, you have to realize, oh, this is actually something different. But the rabbis took it and connected it with um, the other traditions because they didn't understand the original environment well enough.
Okay.
And so here's my goal as a Mesopotamian scholar to try to understand the Bible in its original cognitive and intellectual and political environment. And what it does is it tweaks things. It doesn't take a steam shovel to things. I don't overturn theology, and
Right.
I couldn't if I wanted to because I'm not a theologian to begin with. Um, and so what it does, it sort of tweaks things, maybe in the same way that, I remember watching TV when I was a kid on little black and white, TVs, let's say, circa 1960. It was lots of fun, but I wouldn't want to go back to it now with all the high definition stuff and color and
Right.
all
Yeah.
this other stuff. And so for example, if I look at an old baseball game from even like 1975, it's like, ooh, how could you even watch that now? The angles are terrible. What's the matter with these people? Because of course we're spoiled rotten with that. So now I look at the Bible, through this new lens, and what I try to do is just to try to pull people in. It's like, it takes a lot of study, but you got lots of resources that I didn't have, and so it just sort of tweaks things and helps you, I think, maybe crystallizes an understanding of the text.
Okay. Yeah,
So
that makes perfect sense. One question I had for you, when you talk about Yahweh as opposed to the Babylonian gods, there's a very big difference in character. Could you speak a little bit to that of the character you see in the gods of Mesopotamia as opposed to Israel's God?
yes, and I'll try to be brief because I know our time is coming down. But the point is, I I think the best, by the way, the best book to look at this whole issue happens to be from my professor Bucciolati, who wrote a book about, I think it came out a year ago in English, simply
Okay.
called When on High. And it's basically a comparative study of Mesopotamian and Israelite cognitive environments. And there's nobody else who could do it like he could, because, like I said, he was raised in a very strong Catholic tradition, and he had a high degree in biblical studies, graduate degree, before he decided to go into the ancient Near East. And so he's making these connections, and the difference couldn't be more stark. Maybe even in origin stories. You know, you think about it. Why are humans created in Genesis 1? Well, we're actually not really told why they're created, but God seems to think it was worth creating them in, of course, the divine image. Whatever that means, I'm not entirely sure, but there's a cognate in Akkadian, which the word Salmat or Tsela means statue. And so it means you're some sort of outer representation of the divine being. And then the word image or likeness seems to be something about the inner representation of God. And so we're sort of, where are his image bearers. And so that in other words, we have a very, very important position. We're all, in a sense, royalty, in the sense that we're all in a leadership position, which, of course, probably would be funny if Moses is writing to a bunch of slaves in Egypt. They're probably elbowing each other. Get a load out
Yeah.
of, get a load of that. He thinks we're all royalty. I wonder what he's going to do with our shackles here. Um,
And
and
was that like in Mesopotamia, was that image was more a royal image as
yeah,
opposed to,
oh,
whereas
oh,
in the
yeah,
Hebrew gives more of a humanity, everybody gets
yeah.
the image of God, which is
And then and then secondly, if you look at, in fact, all of the Mesopotamian creation epics, by the way, they have lots of differences, and lots of them are opposite each other. But when it comes to humanity, they're pretty unified in the fact that humanity is sort of an afterthought. There's been war in the heavenly realm. The gods have been fighting. And then it says, for example, that what in the latest one, the Babylonian one, Marduk is, of course, becomes the king of the gods, even though he's a new god. And he's now going to build the superstructure of the universe, and the centerpiece is going to be Babylon. And he wants people to be building Babylon. Well, there are no humans yet, so it's the gods who are doing it. In fact, they're simply called the Anunnaki at that point, which, by the way, is just a catch-all phrase for all the gods at this point.
okay.
Later on, it becomes netherworld gods. And then, of course, in popular tradition, they become outer space aliens. But
Right.
I, I'm not going to go there right now. But
Okay.
um, the point is that humans are created as an afterthought to do all the hard labor that the gods don't want to do: building, dredging canals, getting food and drink, etc. So we're not even there to have a personal relationship with the gods. If I have a tough time with it, I might want to try to make a deal with a particular deity who will now help me out, as long as I'm uh, making a deal with them. But even the gods, by the way, the sum total of the power of all the gods in Mesopotamia isn't the power of the universe. There's something behind them, even intellectually speaking. It's like the order of the universe, which has no personhood to it. Um, but even the gods have to abide by this cosmic order of things. Um, and so the gods, most of them really don't have much of a personality. And the difference between them and, let's say, the God of Israel is the God of Israel is very unpredictable. Now, of course, if you're raised with the Bible and you've read all the stories, it's like, yeah, I know what God's going to do. I already read it. But if you're reading it for
Right.
the first time, it's like, he did what? Why did he
Yeah.
do that? That's completely unlike, the last thing he did. Um,
Right.
and so the God in the Bible has, loads of personality, to the infinite, um, and strong feelings, either positive or negative about things. In fact, even that when it says he's jealous, it's actually zealous. But um, and so they couldn't be more opposite. And of course, if I'm in Israel and I'm talking to a Mesopotamian, they're talking about the power of the universe, I'm saying, I know what that is. It's actually a transcendent being. It's who has personhood, and he's beyond all this other stuff that you're dealing with. And of course, the Bible understands that, except that it uses the same term for God and all the other gods. It's the same word, which has been confusing to us in the modern audience as if, well, what's the difference? Well, there's a huge difference because the term Elohim does not talk about nature, it's talking about function and authority. Uh,
Hmm.
and so um, there is no word for what God is really in terms of his nature. It does the Hebrew writers have no interest in that question. It's just that God, it's a given. What is he? We don't know. He's the sum total of the power of the universe, and he's outside of it. So how am I supposed to describe him? Whenever he's described, it's with earthly terms, and it's incomplete. So
Yeah.
it's like these two cultural traditions, they come from the same environment, but it's like they couldn't be more different. Even Jacob doesn't understand this when he's on the run and and God catches up to him. Jacob says, well, I don't know what chapter, maybe 29 or 30. He tries to make a deal with God. If you do this for me, you can be my God.
Right.
And that's sort of cringy. But if you think about it, what he's doing is he's talking just like a pagan,
Right.
saying, "This is how I think as a pagan."
They
That
tried to manipulate the gods and
well, not only that, it's like, well, are you one of many? I don't really understand how this works right now, and so that's in my own, cognitive environment. That's how it works. You make a deal with the gods because the gods really don't intrinsically care about you. That's why there's no such thing as loving kindness between humans and the gods in Mesopotamia. It can't exist. Here's God in Israel who's he comes to Abraham. I'm approaching you. I want to give you some kindness. Like
yeah,
what God ever did that? Uh,
another
you
big
know,
difference, right? That Yahweh loves his people and makes a covenant with the people, right? I
he
don't
ma-
think they have
he
that.
starts it. Yeah, he starts it, not them.
Right. And another sort of on that note, say like thinking territorial, do you believe Jonah? Do you think he was trying to outrun Yahweh, so to speak? Territorial, is that?
And it's not as if it's not so much it, it it's not so much that uh hold on, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
Um, so it's not so much that Jonah thinks that that other gods are powerful. I think that the Jonah tradition is certainly in the rabbinical tradition that the God of Israel, though he's the God of everything, uh, controls he has his own particular environment, and that's Israel. That's his allotment. And you can look at Deuteronomy 32 about the nations. And the other 70 nations, or 69, or whatever the number is, those were allotted to the other heavenly beings, the lesser Elohim.
Hmm.
So all I have to do is to get out of Yahweh's territory. I know he's ultimately God. And of course, the point of Jonah is to show you can do that, but Yahweh actually does have jurisdiction over everything. That's what's going to happen. And of course, uh, in many respects, even when Jesus goes into the Bashan area of Gentile territory and he starts getting rid of demons, he's basically saying, okay, it's time for God, the God of Israel, to reclaim the nations at this point. Uh,
Hmm.
and so I think Jonah's naively thinking that he can maybe even just temporarily get away. Um,
Right,
I don't think he's a henotheist. I don't think he thinks
right,
that Yahweh doesn't have control of the universe. In fact, the writer is trying to show you're wrong, Jonah.
right,
You thought you could do this. You can't.
right.
Um,
Okay. Yeah, very nice. So
yeah.
I think we're coming up on our time here.
Yeah.
That gives us a good introduction there to the culture. So you have Israel is a part of that culture, so you're going to see those similarities. If you didn't, that would probably be really the red flag. Not that there are commonalities, but then you still are getting that vast difference between the character and the purpose behind the creation. And would that sum it up correctly there?
Yes, and we probably have over 1 million cuneiform texts now, and half of
Wow.
them are in Akkadian. So that's a gigantic corpus to try to understand the biblical text in the same way that let's say you have a book from this day and age. I always use Mark Twain. Let's say you have a Mark Twain, maybe Huckleberry Finn or something, and now it's 5025, and it's the only book that has survived from our civilization. And then all of a sudden, people start excavating the North American continent, and they come upon the Library of Congress, and they're saying, "Wow,
Mm.
uh, now we have this whole corpus to try to understand Mark Twain now." Uh,
Right.
and to me, that's what's happened with the Bible is that we now have this corpus of literature. Sumerian literature is just the Sumerian corpus is larger than the text, the biblical text. And so
Okay.
we now have this very, very large corpus to try to understand things. That's not even talking about the Akkadian material, which is even bigger. And so you can major in Akkadian literature and spend a whole lifetime in it without, um, you know, uh, working through things. And so now we have this gigantic corpus in which to try to provide a context for the biblical text. And it does literally take a lifetime. I mean, I've been working through this, for 50 years now. And my joke is, I can sort of finish with this, is that uh, my field of study has been Mesopotamia as a backdrop to the Bible. Maybe I'll get to the Bible someday. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's not what I'm trying to do in my retirement is I'm trying to now use that as an emphasis. I've been deflecting off of it for really half a century, and now I'm now trying to make it my centerpiece with the background that I have, and it's it's stimulating, to say the very least.
Yes, I bet there's a lot there.
Yes.
Um, okay. Is there anywhere you'd like to direct people to your work, what you're working on? You talked about your podcast briefly, the Buried Bible podcast.
Yeah, the Buried Bible podcast is right now we've done about 30 plus podcasts, and it's going reasonably well. I've got a really good interviewer, Keegan Waltz, who is like, he calls himself Mr. Average Guy who's interested
Right.
in the subject. And so he does everything. I plop in and start talking, and he does everything else. And so I'm
Nice.
very glad. So we've been working through a lot of stuff, mostly in Genesis, but other places too. Um, Maybe the thing that I have done that is probably best known to an audience that you might can start with. Let's see if I can find one. Oh,
Mhm.
one is the primary author here. The first one is John Walton, but I'm third on here. The
Okay.
Bible background commentary, which we did about 25 years ago. Um, it's when we did it, we had no idea that it would be translated into about 12, 15 languages, including Chinese and Arabic and etc. And um, so this is a nice place to start. Just
Okay.
we do commentary um, on verses that you need commentary on that have background information, but so it's not every verse.
Okay.
This is a starter place. It doesn't have a lot of bibliography in it, and so you'll start reading this and say, gee, I really want to know more. And so if you want to know more, then there's the next step.
Okay.
Um, and of course, I'm always going to do a call out for my colleague, Mike Heiser, is
Okay.
that Mike, the reason I like Mike Heiser is that basically, Mike paid all of his dues before he went public. He did all of the graduate work. He did his secular work at Penn State and the UW-Madison, and he had a seminary degree. And so, and then he did a dissertation. And he did all of this stuff, and of course went through, got battered and bloodied intellectually, went to conferences, and then he decided to bring his material forward to a public audience. That's the way to go. Uh,
Hmm.
there are a lot of people out there who have done it in the opposite direction. And to me, it would be like, becoming a welder without going to welding school and paying your dues. Uh,
Right.
and so he, in fact, when I met Mike and we found out that we had not only a lot more in common, we even had a lot more in common personally, because my wife actually had known him years ago in a seminary environment. And so we
Okay.
compared notes and found out that we had never actually connected, but we were nearby. He he um he was at UW-Madison as a graduate student when I was teaching just 2 hours away. I went
Okay.
up and gave lectures at Lagos when he was the scholar in residence up there. But every time I went up there, he wasn't. He was not. He was out of town. So
Right.
anyway, if you want to see how I operate, look at Mike Kaiser, who was light years ahead of me in terms of his public venue. And
Okay.
I can't say enough good things about him. And uh, when I looked at his material, I said, "Yeah, this makes a lot of sense." And then I would cast aside his books and do all the detailed study of his stuff, especially when it came to Mesopotamia, because that wasn't his specialty. And I got to hand it to him. He was right, 99 point, 45% of the time. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, he left a lot of receipts for everybody, didn't he?
sure did. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'll get that link for your podcast as well, and I'll see if I can find links to those books. Is there somewhere that you know I should Amazon, or is there where should I?
Yes, I can even send you PDF files of them too, but I suppose Amazon, I'm assuming they're both in print right now.
Okay.
I haven't paid a lot of attention lately. Uh, but
Okay.
but yeah, Amazon probably is one of the best places to get them. But this is a don't tell anybody, but I think that you can actually, if you work hard, get PDF files of the books.
Okay, very nice. Good to know. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, well, it's been my pleasure.